Welcome everyone to the 2022 Virtual Summit, powered by Terrill and sponsored by the National Foreign Language Center. My name is Laura Terrill, and it is my pleasure to offer you a session on designing learning plans to maximize student learning. First and foremost, I want to look at this sign that says, keep calm and pretend it's on the lesson plan, and recognize for myself, and maybe for many of you, that I have taught far more lesson plans that did not go as planned than those that went exactly as planned. But still, we can keep in mind some key questions in the hopes that that will give us more lesson plans that go as anticipated. So what do we really need to consider when we're designing lessons so that students engage in and retain their learning? What are the key components of a learning episode? And then why is it so important that within our learning episodes, within lessons, we are frequently checking for learning? I wanted to take and put the learning plan into the context of a unit because we have to know what our destination is. So using a unit called our ecological footprint, with an essential question of what are we doing or what can we do to create a more sustainable lifestyle, thinking about how different cities around the world and in the target cultures are really thinking about creating sustainable cities, and then targeting this unit at the novice high level. So when we're thinking about designing units or lessons, we're really thinking about two approaches. The first is to really think about the work that we do as activity designers. And then we're asking ourselves, well, what would make this interesting and engaging for students? And if I'm thinking that way, I might be thinking about, oh, what vocabulary game could I play today to make this more interesting for students? But that is not likely to give us the results that we want. And so what we want to make sure we're doing, whether it's unit design, lesson design, is we want to think like an assessor. What are those tasks that we can create that would truly show that students understand and can apply their new learning? And we need to make sure that that happens more than once during a lesson. So if we take that unit, we know that any good unit is going to have clear goals anchored by functional statements, ask and answer questions. So you can read through this, pause and look at each goal, or you can find the unit in the Google folder where the materials are shared, and I'll give you a link at the end of the presentation. We can think about what different cities are doing to create this sustainable living environment. We can share priorities for sustainable living. So we have to know what types of things we expect our students to be able to do. And then we have to have planned our sample assessments, our assessments for the unit. You're just seeing some samples here. So what will they do in the interpretive mode? What will they do in the presentational mode by the end of the unit? What will they do in the interpersonal mode? And if I have that in mind as I'm thinking about my units, then it's like a destination. If I know where I'm going and I take the directional steps appropriately, I'm more likely to get there. If my lessons go awry and I know my destination, that's a detour. But detours can be put back on track if we clearly know where we're going. So if you would just take a minute to look at this and think about this visual as a learning episode, and in your mind, pause this video and think, what does this suggest? And if you've taken that time, what you may have noticed is that the teacher at the beginning of the lesson has the primary responsibility. This is that I do moment. And then the teacher and the student, it's a more balanced approach. And there's a lot of mutual support. You're working together. The teacher's role is diminishing and the student is doing more of the work, but they're still supported, usually by their peers, but the teacher is walking around, giving guidance. And then finally, yes, the teacher is still there, but that individual student is taking responsibility and demonstrating that they can do it alone. And so you're looking at that gradual release of responsibility, where in that learner-centered classroom, the teacher is gradually releasing control to the learners. And this chart is also in the Google folder. And so it can give you a lot more clarifying information on what each part of the lesson may look like from the perspective of gradual release of responsibility. And I'm going to try to model that for you with some examples also. When I'm planning my lessons, I'm thinking about GRR, gradual release of responsibility, moving from I do, we do, you do together to you do alone. But as I'm also thinking about the work of David Sousa, the primacy recency effect, where he's talking a little bit more about learning in the brain and the attention span of the learner. And he gives the information sharing that the maximum attention span of the adult learner is 20 minutes, and then shares that the attention span really does not surpass the age of the learner. So a 10-year-old, 10 minutes. And within this cycle, this primacy recency, he is saying that there is a prime time at the beginning, which we often talk about being the most important, the highest degree of retention. There's a downtime, and then there's a prime time too. And we're going to look at the implications of that within a lesson also. So the students enter my classroom and they are excited. There's energy in the room. You have to settle them down to start the learning process. And so the beginning of every lesson, within 2 to 3 minutes, should have something that grabs the attention of the learner, activates their prior knowledge, gets them ready for what's coming next. That's going to be the input. That's when the teacher is working the hardest. So what is it you're intending to provide? What's the most important thing you plan to do in this lesson? Do it first. You're probably going to be guiding that part of the lesson completely by the choices that you make. Then no matter how good you are, that attention is going to wane. You can see it in your learners. They begin to settle. The brain goes from bright red to pink and duller, and they're still learning, but it's not peak learning. That's when you're going to be guiding the students, or they're going to be working together. And then as you're beginning to close this learning cycle, you're going to have the 20-minute maximum. Maybe you'll fudge it and it'll be 30. But then that gives you that opportunity for each student to individually apply their new learning, giving you that check for learning that lets you see that every student is making progress toward the learning target. So at the top, you're seeing, yes, okay, we've got this science in our brains about primacy recency. We're thinking about gradual release of responsibility, but we can't lose sight of the fact that this episode is anchored by a learning target that is visible and apparent to the students throughout the lesson, and that each learning target within this segment of 20 minutes, no more than 30 minutes, ends with a check for learning. So that is the combination of gradual release of responsibility and primacy recency. So in the lesson, what's happening is you are setting this learning target. You are thinking about that check for learning, that closure of that first segment, that first learning episode. And you're thinking about, okay, what will they be? And then what will connect the two? So it's really like wrapping up a package when you put together a learning episode. So it's really important when you're setting that can-do statement, that functional piece of language, as it says here. You start with a language function because that's what describes how we use language in our daily lives. It gives us the purpose for speaking, or the purpose for writing, or the purpose for listening, the purpose for reading. And so a clear language function is going to begin with a functional chunk: discuss, name, identify, sequence. And those are the words that you're always going to see, whether it's a unit goal, a can-do statement, or your directions for an assessment task. What is it you want them to be able to do so that their communication is effective? There is a chart in the Google folder of language functions. And so you're going to see, if you look closely at this chart, which you can't read real easily, but it's there for you to reference later, that these functions then are divided into input and output. So input functions, I'm not asking them to produce language. I'm asking them to demonstrate that they understand the language that they're hearing. And output functions, whether it's interpersonal or presentational, they will be producing language. And there's just that one cautionary piece. Read, write, listen, speak, understand are not functions. So if you find yourself writing that lesson can-do statement, that learning target, and you're tempted to begin with one of the skill words, just stop, pull out this handy chart, and look and think, what is it I really want students to be able to do with their language? How will I know they understand? How will they demonstrate that? They're not just speaking, but they're speaking for a purpose. They're speaking to describe, they're speaking to compare, and really think about the purpose of the language that they're going to be using. So in this example that I'm going to show you, if I've anchored this chart that we've already looked at with that can-do statement up here in the corner, I can recognize initiatives in different cities that contribute to a sustainable lifestyle. By choosing the word recognize, I am saying that I am going to be doing an interpretive activity. I'm going to do interpretive activities primarily working with language, or at least that's all I expect them to be able to do by the end of this episode, is to demonstrate comprehension. So you have to start to think about, okay, if all I want them to be able to do is recognize, then what will I have them do? I will do some type of check for learning in the interpretive mode. I might ask them to signal. I might ask them to sequence or match images to captions. I might ask them to act out or point or circle, but I am not going to ask them to do anything that requires producing language in the presentational mode or in the interpersonal mode. So these examples are here for you when you're starting to think about a check for learning that requires output or production of language. And then I've used these slides before, and teachers have said, oh, but these are also simplistic. So here are some that are also categorized, but they're categorized more at the intermediate. So they're asking for learners to do more because they have more language at that point. So again, these are short segments. So these are here for you to consider later if you want to go back to them. So when we think about this schema that we looked at before then, I can recognize initiatives in different cities that contribute to a sustainable lifestyle, interpretive can-do statement, interpretive learning target, requires an interpretive check for understanding. And so students are going to be asked to look at an image. Now that image is going to come from something that I've used in the segment in order to make this a check for what they've understood during this learning episode. And I'm going to give them, as a teacher, 3 statements, and 1 will be a lie. So 2 truths and a lie, basically. And then each student will individually signal whether statement 1, 2, or 3 is the lie. And if your students are like mine, you may have to ask them to put their heads down on their desks, close their eyes, or in some other fashion signal 1, 2, or 3 without being able to sneak a look at their neighbor. Then if you want to just extend that a little bit, you might have them pair to correct the lie. So they've heard something that's false or read something that's false, and they need to be able to fix that lie. So this now leads you to the art of teaching. How you as a teacher choose to get them from point A to point B really relies on you, what you know about your students, what you feel comfortable with. So while in a curriculum, we often say that the goals are set, you're told by your district, This is what you have to be able to do by the end of this unit, by the end of this level. That's the science of teaching, that written curriculum. But the art of teaching means that you choose how to get them to that end point. It doesn't really matter what your choices are. That science of teaching tells us that within this maximum attention span, which Susa says is 20 minutes, and then the realist in me says, well, if I do 30 minutes, that's pretty good. Or if I have younger learners and I think of it as an attention span of 15-minute chunks, that's pretty good. But what we don't want to do is take that 90-minute block and not think about this. So a good learning plan sequence, a good episode is always going to, at least at the beginning of the class period, grab their attention. It's going to provide that input. It's going to do something to make sure that they know what they're doing so that they don't start saying, what do we do? You're still helping them, you're guiding them. Then you want to step back a little bit further, kind of just be in that position to walk around, let them do the work with their peers, help each other. And then finally say, well, here's one final activity where I'm going to ask each of you to apply individually so I can see who's got it, who doesn't. And of course, really at every phase of the lesson, in one way or another, you're giving feedback. You're listening in, you're gently reshaping, you're repeating, you're paraphrasing, you're circumlocuting based on the impressions you have of how things are going. So if you think about this in terms of a specific lesson, under the learning target of I can recognize initiatives in different cities that contribute to a sustainable lifestyle. You've just walked into my class. I want to grab your attention. And really the best way to grab the attention of today's learners is with video, music, or images, or a combination of all three. But here I'm just using images for the purpose of this session. But I'm going to post the question. Do you want to live in this city? Why or why not? Well, I don't expect them to have all kinds of new vocabulary about sustainable cities. I just want them maybe to say, because they're novice high, yes, it's interesting, or yes, it's pretty, or no, it's weird, or I'm not sure, I don't know what is happening. And then I also want to invite them to ask questions. What is this? Where is this? Is it a real city? And I want them to do all of this, of course, in the target language. But on that question piece, I might let them cheat after they've written all the questions they can in the target language. If they want to generate other questions in English, I'm interested in those questions. I'm trying to provoke curiosity. The pictures are giving me novelty, asking them to think about them. What do they want to know? If I'm going to teach a unit on sustainable living, I want to know what their questions are, because then I can design future lessons to meet their questions. So that doesn't take that long. That's like a 3, 4, 5 minute at the most segment of the class, just to grab their attention before we move into the learning episode. Still the same learning target. And now there's a very short reading here. Let's say this is towards the end of a level 1 class or the beginning of a level 2 class in that novice high area. And I've given some suggestions off to the side. This is exactly the way the text was. The bold that's there is the bold that was in the article. And I'm saying, well, hide the title. Let the students read silently and individually. And all they're doing when they're doing that first reading is they're highlighting the words that they think they know, the words, the phrases, because there are a lot of cognates here. Now, I know for Chinese, it's the reading aloud that might help them. Read slowly and they may be able to highlight the characters, for example, that they hear you say that they already know. And then read aloud a second time and let them do it again. So it just depends on your language, what you can do in that step 2, step 3. They might then turn and share words and phrases they understood with their partner, or just let you know, call out what words they knew. You then start to call attention to new phrases that are bolded and make connections to those earlier pictures. So when they're talking about buildings that have vegetation on them, you can go back and look at that. Or when they're talking about cities that are on the vertical, then you can go back and show what that means and act out and draw horizontal, vertical. Then you might provide 3 choices for the title and have students predict the correct title before you reveal the title. So all of that was input from you. It was your voice, you were controlling the pace. You were eventually calling attention to new words and new phrases in the context of what they were reading. You were starting to get at main idea by having them predict the title. So a lot of that was on the teacher. It was a very teacher intensive part. Now I don't want to turn them loose yet. I think that text is still not well understood. I think they've got some of those words that were cognates. But then now I want to provide some sentence starters that use language that's more familiar to them. I know what they know from previous units, and then can they complete it? Can they give me that summary statement? So whether they're working individually or in pairs, I'm going to be coaching and helping quite a bit here. So by showing one sentence starter at a time, asking them to jot down what they think would be a good answer, before I'm calling on them, maybe I provide some clues. And that article at the very end talks about insect flower, which was quite interesting to look up. And so by doing it one at a time, I'm reading aloud, I'm calling attention to more images, and then I'm going to eventually give them the correct answer before we go on to the second one. So throughout this, with each sentence, it's kind of the same process. Take your best guess, see an image, turn to your partner, see if you agree, disagree, and then call on non-volunteers for a possible response. Keep going. We will grow our own food in. What's the answer? And then water. And then as you're building this, you're going back into the text that they already read and asking them to identify the corresponding more sophisticated language that's part of the article. So their easy words like water become aquaphone, agricultural production in the water, whatever that exact word is, and they get more sophisticated in their language. And so a fourth example about rooftop gardens or urban gardening. I stayed real involved in that. I controlled it. I decided when to show number 1, 2, 3, and 4. I selected the pictures to show to help them. I was calling on non-volunteers. I was causing them to look back at the article we had read earlier during the first input phase and helping them make connections between these easier sentence stems and those that were in the article. Now I'm ready to step back further and say, okay, I need to see what you can do on your own. Now, the beauty of what these two are is that this is the image that went with the article. So I've held the image, and this time what I'm choosing to do is cover up key words. In this case, the way it's looking is I've underlined them so you can see the words that I'm going to blank out. I'm going to blank out retour and densifier and vertical. And so these are words that I think they can reasonably figure out from context based on the reading we've done or the work that I know they've done previously. So now they're going to be working with a partner in a small group, and they're going to be using that article to attempt to replace the words that are missing from this infographic. And then you give them time to complete it. There's no word bank. You're hoping they don't need it, that they've internalized the language and that they can figure out or make good guesses. But after they've compared their initial responses as a check, you might want to provide the word bank and then allow the students to complete or change responses. And then finally, you show the infographic and they check their responses. And then you could do more with the infographic in another segment of the lesson. So you've just been walking around and providing guidance. Your guidance there might sound like, and reading something aloud. Or you might pause to ask a question with either or to try to get them on track. But then you're going to step away and let them try to figure it out within their own partner, with their partner or in their small group. So if you've timed things right, you're coming up on that 25 to 30 minutes, and you know you need to close this segment of the lesson. And you just want to get a sense of who is beginning to understand some of this new vocabulary. So the game, two truths and a lie, and you would just maybe show this picture. You could have them read the three words, the three sentences. You could show the reading and read it to them, or you could just make it a listening activity where you say the sentence, they signal that they believe that number two is the lie, and then they correct that actual piece and make it a simple sentence to make it true. But the real part of the activity is you're watching to see, of all the students, when you say signal 1, 2, or 3, how many of the students are getting the correct lie, because that's demonstrating comprehension. And remember, that's what you were after, that they could identify those new ideas about sustainable living, not talk about it, not produce it. Doesn't mean that they don't use the interpersonal mode or the presentational mode during this interpretive strong lesson. It just means that it doesn't end with production of language. It ends with checking for comprehension. So you'll find in the Google folder an actual learning plan template that you can use for your own needs. You will find an actual lesson plan written out for this lesson of what I've been saying that you could refer back to. And then if you want more information on the effective learning cycles, there are new documents in the TELL series. So learner pathways, and there's one on sequencing activities to maximize learning. So if you go to the Pro website, you can download that PDF, and it gives you entry points into thinking about doing some of this or doing different aspects of this when you're designing your own lessons. So I wanted to say this at the very end. If you remember, I started by saying that keep calm, pretend it's on the lesson plan. You know, we put a lot of responsibility on ourselves as teachers, but the truth is, all we can really do is try to provide the conditions in which our students can learn. And so you just want to follow the science of learning, the new research on the brain and how the brain learns, and you want to incorporate that into your lessons so that you're doing as much as you can to create those learning conditions. So in that sense, then if we pause here and just think about retrieval, which is another whole aspect to enhancing learning, you would stop before you go off into your busy lives or watch another session and really think about, of the things that I've said, the slides you've seen, what is one technique that you might really apply to your teaching? And since it's rather open-ended, it's calling for elaboration. But what I would suggest is before you move on, you think about that, and then you hold yourself responsible at your check for learning on this session, and you just send yourself a text so you can remember, oh, I want to think more about this the next time I'm designing a lesson. So I want to thank you very much for being part of the 2022 Summit. And then if you have any questions, you can reach out. My email's there. You can get resources through the website for the conference, but also I've created a separate folder just in case there are any glitches, and you can access it through this link here, this Google folder. So thank you very much for taking time out from your summer, which is supposed to be time for rest and relaxation, to do just a little bit of professional learning. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit, and I hope you have a wonderful summer. All teachers deserve a wonderful summer. Thank you.